Thank you very much for joining us. We are now in one more important edition of Oncology Beyond the Obvious, and we are delighted to, be flattered because, as you know, imitation is the best form of flattery. Today, we are going to discuss a very important topic, as all the topics are important, but this is on pembrolizumab in early breast cancer, the Keynote 522 study. And as you can see on the screen, the interview is Dr. Amit Agarwal. And then we'll have the panel discussion moderated by Dr. Senthil Rajappa. And finally, the lasting end word from Dr. Sudeep Gupta as the expert. So may I invite my colleague, Dr. Amish Vora, to start the proceedings, please.
Thank you so much, sir, and good evening, everyone. As you all know, Parik sir mentioned Keynote 522 is today's discussion. The idea of selecting this paper is because till February 2021, this paper was not considered as a practice-changing paper. But in June, July, after FDA's reconsideration, the guidelines have incorporated this as a practice-changing paper. So let's dissect this out further. Can I have my next slide, please? So New England Journal of Medicine in 2020 had come out with this publication. The chief author is Dr. Peter Smith, and online there is flurry of interviews by Dr. Peter Smith regarding Keynote 522. Next slide, please. So the design was, I would say, simple or complex, whichever way we look at it. Eligibility criteria was all patients are triple negative breast cancer. They have to be above 18 years of age, and they are falling into category of high risk triple negative, that is defined by T1C onwards, but patients who were T1C had to have node positive, while T2, T3 and T4 may have node negative or node positive both. A good ECOG performance status and a pre-specified PD-L1 testing was allowed. The randomization was in the fashion of 2:1, that is in the neoadjuvant phase and in adjuvant phase both. In neoadjuvant setting, chemotherapy plus pembrolizumab in one arm and chemotherapy plus placebo in another arm. Chemotherapy arm consisted of carboplatin plus paclitaxel followed by AC or EC in both the arms. I repeat, platinum was given to every patient enrolled in this trial. Surgery was done, radiation if required was done, and then in adjuvant setting, pembrolizumab alone was continued for nine cycles as compared to placebo in the control arm. Next slide, please. The baseline characteristics, young age, we all know TNBC, 49 and 48 was the median age. I was very surprised, we don't do routinely PD-L1. I was very surprised, 83% of patients were PD-L1 positive. And 50% of the patients were node positive. So this was something which was, little surprising for me at least. Next slide, please. Primary endpoint were two, pathological complete response rate and EFS. The first primary endpoint in all patients, the definition what they had said was YPT0 or TIS. 64.8% in pembro arm compared to 51% in placebo arm with a difference of 13.6%. If you take a strict YPT0N0, then it was 59.9% versus 45.3%. The delta was 14.5%. And sorry, YPT0 or TIS, not looking at the node, then you had a higher number of patients achieving PAT-CR. Next slide, please. This is the slide I have taken from ESMO, and that's why it comes like a camera recorded. On my right-hand side, I wanted to highlight PD-L1 positive and PD-L1 negative. PD-L1 positive patients numerically had a higher number of PAT-CR as compared to all patients. PD-L1 negative had numerical lower PAT-CR, but delta was higher in PD-L1 positivity, PD-L1 negativity. Next slide, please. This was the first follow-up. at 18 months, and there was the second primary endpoint of EFS was again met. The next slide, please. At 39 months of follow-up, the curves were still separating, and pembrolizumab arm progression-free survival was of 84.5% as compared to 76.8% in the placebo or non-pembrolizumab arm, with a hazard ratio of 0.63 and p-value of 0.00031. Next slide, please. There was no new safety signal except that there were 3 deaths in the pembrolizumab arm compared to 1 death in the placebo arm. But please remember, the randomization was 2:1. So we really do not know what happened. Next slide, please. In February 2021, Merck had applied for approval. FDA committee unanimously refused based on PAT-CR alone, and they said EFS data of 18 months follow-up is not sufficient. Merck continued to update their interim analysis, and the 4th interim analysis, they again presented to FDA, which was also presented in ASCO 2021 plenary session. FDA agreed with the results that yes, you have met the primary endpoint and approved the combo. Next slide, please. As a result of this, if you open NCCN guidelines today, that is the 8th version of 2021, they say that high-risk triple-negative breast cancer, you can use this combination of Keynote 522. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. This was the short presentation about Keynote 522. And now we come to today's interviewee, Dr. Amit Agarwal. Amit has been a very dear friend, a very good colleague, and excellent human being. Currently, he is the director of Fortis Shalimar Group in the Department of Oncology. Amit has always been a Delhiite or a Delhi boy. He has done his MBBS from UCMS, MD from MAMC, and DM from AIIMS. Is a very keen researcher and very good critic. If you dissect out any trial which Amit has read, you will really enjoy the way he reads in between the line and dissects out the data. And today I'm sure he's going to do the same for us. Amit is also known to speak his mind, and he's a very, very pro-doctor community. In spite of being in private practice for last so many years, if you Google papers published by Dr. Amit Agarwal, you will be surprised that Amit has collected so much of data and he has published also. Like, I remember 100 patients of chemotoxicity, which recently he published, which was a treat to read because this was his own data from his own institute. If one sentence, if I have to sum up, and I try to do that, Amit Agarwal is a very good colleague to have next to your chamber, and he should be your colleague till you retire. With that, Amit, I welcome you on this platform.
Thank you, Amish. That was too lofty for me. You forgot to mention TMH, and that's how we started together as colleagues. Right. So I think that's another thing which we kind of shared, started almost together, didn't we?
Yes, we started together in Tata Memorial Hospital. But I think in AIIMS, you overtook and you became my senior. Of course, by going by the intelligence, you should always be my senior, Amit.
We started the rush into TMH from AIIMS, didn't we? You, me, Hari Menon, Goyal, Shaji, so many of us.
I agree. And those were the golden era, which everybody believes that their DM was the golden era. We were
and then Sudeep started the reverse rush from AIIMS to
TMH. So Amit, before we go on to Keynote 522 specifics, there is some rapid fire questions for you, and I would request you to answer in a rapid fire fashion. Question 1 is, out of 10 cases of CA breasts you see in your clinic, how many are triple negative breast cancer?
About 30%.
30%. What is the median age of TNBC?
Around 45. I think around 45 to 50, more like 45.
So they are youngish. What is the median stage which you see? Metastatic versus non-metastatic?
I would say there is stage migration, and about 50 to 60% are non-metastatic and about 40% are metastatic.
You're absolutely right. ICMR registry data of 2020 they say that nowadays 30% are metastatic and 70% are non-metastatic, but that was breast cancer all put together. If we dissect out TNBC, you might be right about that. Amit, second question is that when the primary breast biopsy is done, turns out to be triple negative, on the CT scan, PET scan, you see a lymph node. Before labeling lymph node positive patients, do you rely on FNAC and biopsy of the lymph node as well?
Yes, so I don't rely on CT and a PET scan for a lymph node exera, but I definitely rely on the palpability of the lymph node, the feel of it. And even if it is negative, I go for an ultrasound guided FNAC of it.
Correct. Right. Great. I think that is what we all have started doing lately in last couple of years. Amit, do you regularly or have you started regularly doing BRCA and PD-L1 in your patients of triple negative breast cancer?
After Olympia, yes, I have been advising them unless and until, but I was not doing it before, unless until they have a strong family history like a breast or an ovarian cancer. Therefore, then I was doing it. But since Olympia, yes, we have started to advise BRCA and BRCA2, both BRCA1 and BRCA2, to more and more patients now, almost universal and selected in these patients who are eligible.
Okay. If you decide for neoadjuvant chemotherapy, what is your stage? When do you decide that this patient is going for neoadjuvant chemotherapy in your clinic?
So, largely speaking, I don't offer ER/PR positive patients the neoadjuvant chemotherapy.
Only of triple.
So in triple negative, I tried my own guidelines in my own mind is that if it is T2 or a node positive, then I start advising them a neoadjuvant chemo.
Okay. What are the drugs you select for neoadjuvant? Is it ACT or do you incorporate platinum also outside the setting of a clinical trial?
So I was using largely AC followed by T. Only since last month or so, since the data of platinum started to emerge largely from brightness trial, although the trial was not aimed to answer that question. But still, after that trial, I have started using carboplatinum in these triple negative patients, irrespective of BRCA status.
Okay, perfect. In your institute, what is the definition of PAT-CR? Do you take YPT0N0 or TIS also is okay as definition of PAT-CR?
We don't have any institutional definition, but I'm more happy when it is no carcinoma in situ evident.
All of us are happy, but do you take TIS as PAT-CR when the patient is sitting in front of you?
No, so T0N0, no carcinoma in situ.
Okay, excellent. So you do not take TIS as PAT-CR. What percentage of patients in your clinic achieve PAT-CR after NACT, Amit?
I think approximately 30%, 35% of the patient would achieve PAT-CR. Obviously, this is before the platinum. We know that platinum increases the PAT-CR. So our values may change now, but I think approximately 30% would achieve a PAT-CR.
Okay, excellent, 30%. And with platinum, I'm sure you will see more and more PAT-CR. The last question of the rapid fire, Amit, have you been using capecitabine on a regular basis in North PAT-CR, TNBC after CREATE-X?
Oh, yes. Almost universally.
Almost universally. So good to hear that, we all are taking cognizance of the trial and the guidelines. Although I must say that 2000 milligram per meter square of the dose of capecitabine is nearly impossible for Indian patients to achieve. And I'm sure you also must have faced the same.
1500 milligram per meter square is perhaps most of my patients would receive, and sometimes they would even receive less than that.
Okay, excellent. Amit, now let's come to Keynote 522, since we have established how do you treat these patients in your clinical practice. I always ask this question, first question to everyone. Was there an unmet need in triple negative breast cancer to do this study? We have CREATE-X where capecitabine has shown improvement in overall survival. We have Olympia trial where olaparib, even after neoadjuvant or adjuvant, have shown improvement in EFS with a good delta. And now we have Keynote 522, which has met both the primary endpoint. Do you think it was an unmet need to carry out this study?
So, Amish, when this trial was started, at that point of time, there was no CREATE-X, there was no Olympia. So obviously, if you look from that perspective, there was clear unmet need, which has been met. Obviously, that creates now a problem because by the time the trial has been published, we have an option. We have now plenty of both A, the capecitabine, and B, in a very small select population to give olaparib, as the Olympia trial showed. But I still believe that this trial serves a great purpose. I think it has met to a larger degree an unmet need. I believe it has met the unmet need, yes. But the problem of plenty is definitely there.
I agree with you, Amit. When I saw PDL1 positivity of 80%, I was surprised. But we will talk about PDL1 little later. Let's come to inclusion criteria. That is my second question. Inclusion criteria defined high-risk triple-negative breast cancer as T1C N plus, which I agree. But do you think T2N0 M0 achieving PAT-CR after NACT, would you label that as high-risk triple-negative breast cancer?
So then, if you look at the appendix, there is no answer to the fact that how do they select, why did they leave out T1C N0? I think that's what your question is pertaining to.
My question is very simple, that we are looking at giving 1 year of pembrolizumab to these patients. T2N0, N positive I can understand, but T2N0 achieving PAT-CR after NACT really deserve 1 year of adjuvant pembrolizumab? That is the question. That's why I asked this question.
So one would have to see why this trial incorporated these patients. My own calculation on this perspective is that the patient who are either T2N0 or T1C N1, let's say so, they would have a possibility of relapse rate of approximately 30% or 35%. That is what my calculation is. So I think what they were trying to do was trying to cull out high-risk patients who have a higher chances of relapse than any other subset of patients like HER2 or ER positive. That represents unmet need. Yes, that much number is an unmet need. That also allows to cull them, those patients who will have a higher chance of relapse, and the events will be easier to decipher. So therefore, the trial N size would be smaller and they'll be able to show a benefit. So both it represents a higher unmet need and possibly a trial in which the benefit could be easily shown. I think that's why these patients were taken. Possibly answers your perspective. Yes, I consider T2N0 as a high-risk patient in triple-negative breast cancer.
I'm so happy to hear that anything about 20% relapse risk, we still are considering at high risk, and we would not stop anything less than 100% cure rate. Let's come to trial design on that, since we are talking on eligibility criteria. Amit, I was very much intrigued by placebo arm or the chemotherapy arm. Every patient had to receive platinum. Should we applaud investigators for this, or as always, as Senthil was saying, that they should have had one more arm of non-platinum, like anybody in our WhatsApp group would start saying that?
I think they should have two more arms. We can discuss about that. But either they were intelligent and judged that, or they knew that this is extremely important. By the time these guys were reporting the 36-month data set, brightness trial was coming. So now obviously they would have not known how the brightness trial would be reported as. Correct. But at this point of time, now that the brightness trial has kind of stated that carboplatinum or a platinum is important, I think that solves this trial's question. In fact, if this trial would not have had platinum, what would have been the question? The question would have been, as Senthil says, the same advantage we could have had if the platinum was there in place of IO, isn't it? That would have been the question. So I can achieve the same result with platinum and don't have to give immunotherapy. In fact, by keeping the platinum, they have killed this discussion. There is no such discussion as platinum or not platinum. They are extremely lucky that brightness has appeared on the horizon at the time of their 36 months follow-up. Otherwise, they would have had to answer the question of why did you use platinum? CALGB did not prove its value, and neither the other trial of JEPAR proved its value, although they had a high PAT-CR, but it is the brightness that proved the value, forcing us or suggesting us to use a platinum. And this trial kind of comes at the right time of using platinum and immunotherapy rather than immunotherapy versus platinum. I think they're simple, plain lucky that they believed in platinum and used it.
Thank you so much, Amit. That answers the question. And in fact, rather than they were lucky, I would say that they asked the right scientific question, they designed in a right way, and they hoped that the science would prevail, and that is what happened. Now, my second question about the trial design, Amit, is neoadjuvant and adjuvant setting, both they have used pembrolizumab. Now, I am little confused here. Did we achieve event-free survival at 36 months because of neoadjuvant pembro adding on to PAT-CR, or adjuvant pembrolizumab in non-PAT-CR, it added on to event-free survival? Don't you think there is a paradox and there are two separate questions which never will be answered based on this design?
Yeah, we could not answer the question based on this design. So that is exactly where I said, thinking retrospectively, now that we are smarter, this should have been a 4-arm trial. These 2 arms are there. The 3rd arm should have been all patients receiving only adjuvant pembrolizumab, okay, in all these patients. And the 4th arm should have been only neoadjuvant and no adjuvant. If you would have had that trial, which is easy for me to say, and it is a very difficult trial, would possibly require 5,000 to 6,000 patients to have that adequate statistical strength, then I think all these questions would have been answered. But anyway, this is what we have. So how do you think the 2 curves, both PAT-CR curves would have been, or a non-PAT-CR curve would have been, if there was no adjuvant component? Do you think they would have maintained the same sanctity? Would the non-PAT-CR curve, the PAT-CR curve would have been very similar to this if there was no adjuvant component to it? Or similarly, would the non-PAT-CR curve remain so far apart if there was no adjuvant component? So you could say there is no role of adjuvant component. I think this trial doesn't answer this question at this point of time. We take it what it is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would have been happy if there would have been, as you rightly said, 4th arm of no adjuvant pembrolizumab, and maybe 4,000 patients in 18 months flat time, they could accrue 1,140 patients. I'm sure that another 2,000 patients would not have been a possibility. But as you rightly said, retrospectively, one is always wiser and we can always ask 1,000 questions. But I take your point. Now, coming to the primary endpoint of the trial design, and to save time, I will combine the 2 questions together for you to answer, Amit. There was a meta-analysis done for PAT-CR, and the hazard ratio for overall survival was 0.16. That if you achieve PAT-CR, this was your hazard ratio of improving the survival. FDA approved PAT-CR as one of the primary endpoint, and Keynote 522 achieved that primary endpoint. But when Merck went to FDA in February 21, they rejected it. Isn't this a paradox? Why do you approve upfront when you have this? Amit, your comments.
So I would not have accepted this trial if the PAT-CR was the only event that would have been achieved and the event-free survival would not have been achieved. So coming back to the meta-analysis, that actually did not prove that ability to achieve a PAT-CR is able to achieve a higher EFS. It actually proved the fact, beyond doubt, that PAT-CR people would have a much better EFS and OS compared to a non-PAT-CR. We're talking about meta-analysis published in 2020. I believe that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely right.
So it does not prove that point. It just proves the point, as is evident in this trial also. People who achieve PAT-CR are very different from people who do not achieve PAT-CR.
Correct.
That's a proven point. But I don't agree to PAT-CR being a surrogate marker of EFS. There are examples before. The lapatinib was given a neoadjuvant, achieved high PAT-CR, and did not prove its point from survival data. Then we have had bevacizumab. It had a higher PAT-CR. It did not result in a meaningful survival data, therefore never got approved. Now let's come into an immune arena. That's what we're talking about. There was a trial on durvalumab as a neoadjuvant trial. It hardly met the PAT-CR criteria, but actually met the EFS criteria with the same delta. Despite not being able to achieve a PAT-CR values, it was able to achieve a same delta. Look at this own trial. Here, the benefit seems to be driven more by non-PAT-CR rather than PAT-CR patient. So this trial kind of proves the point that the benefit between 2 PAT-CR is not very much. A delta is 2 or 2.5. Why so? If you achieve a PAT-CR with a chemotherapy, that is qualitatively as good as a PAT-CR achieved with addition of immunotherapy. Yes, more people would achieve PAT-CR with immunotherapy. But if you're looking at the 2 curves, one is very clear, is that in absolute quantum value, the non-PAT-CR seems to be driving this benefit rather than the PAT-CR in an absolute value. I believe if a drug works like a Herceptin, like a rituximab, like a paclitaxel, it would result in a significantly relevant clinical benefit, and that will also show as a PAT-CR. So PAT-CR would also be shown, but it is a survival which will be shown. A drug which is weak may transiently show a PAT-CR, but may not show a long-term benefit, which is a clinically meaningful benefit. So I think FDA was wrong before and FDA was right, and the FDA is now right.
Amit, one point, and we will not argue about that. One thing where I probably differ to agree with you is that non-PAT-CR driving EFS may not be true because some of the pembrolizumab treated NACT arm entered into PAT-CR because of pembrolizumab. Mm-hmm. So it is very, very difficult to dissect it out. Let's reach out to our second question. Next question, Amit. Again, we are running a little short of time. Does PD-L1 positivity matter? I'm saying that because PD-L1 positivity, the difference in delta was 14%, and PD-L1 negative, the difference in delta was 15.9%.
So
the question is,
I think I know what you are saying. I think if you look at the answer from the trial perspective, we don't need to do a PD-L1 testing. What am I going to do? I am possibly going to test for PD-L1. Why? Because we know there's another evidence from plenary session that higher the PD-L1 positivity, then you have a higher PCR rate. I'm not going after PCR rate though. But after a particular PD-L1, they had a PCR rate of 80%. So in my country, where cash is limited, and not everybody can actually take this drug. If somebody comes who has a limited amount of cash and has a PD-L1 ratio or PD-L1 value of around 80% or 90%, I am myself thinking that this is the gentleman who is possibly going to get a PCR rate of 80%. And I'm myself thinking that this patient's event-free survival rate is going to be something like 95 or 96% as per shown in this patient. So I would say, you may possibly merit this drug because you're likely to do well, and unwell rate may be only 5%. Can I support it based on the trial? Absolutely not. Okay. But can I do it in my practice? Yes, I can do largely because there'll be very, very few people who can afford it. But if somebody who comes and say, I can afford it, absolutely no qualms in saying that PD-L1 is otherwise a non-essential thing. I think it's a practical thing of doing it in a selected cases rather than a standard answer on a trial basis.
I agree, Amit. So your short answer is that PD-L1 may not matter as far as the trial results are read. But in your country, which happens to be my country also, since last I remember, the economics may drive the decision to do PD-L1, and we would leave that to Senthil for discussion in moderation. My second last question, are you worried about any safety signals in this trial?
Not very many. There were few more deaths, and as you already mentioned, the randomization was 2:1. So 3 versus 1 death does not amount to any significantly heightened death. Not surprising was that most of the toxicity was seen in the neoadjuvant phase when the chemotherapy was on. And we know that immunotherapies are not the absolutely safe drug. 1+1 is not 2 here, 1+1 is 3. But in the adjuvant phase, when there was only pembrolizumab, it was a very smooth sailing, and that's how we see. And isn't it that we have been combining chemotherapy and immunotherapy for, let's say, lung cancer, and we find it not very, very difficult to do. But there is a learning curve, and we all learn. And I think we have done that a bit. And I think the toxicity is not exceptionally over and above what we have been seeing.
I completely agree, Amit. The last question, which is mandatory to ask to every interviewee, according to you, the updated analysis of Keynote 522. Has it met its primary endpoint to your satisfaction to the extent that this is a practice-changing paper in your practice going forward from tomorrow? And if it is yes, then are you forced to use platinum in all patients as it was the trial design in Keynote 522? 2 questions, 2 answers, quickly.
Platinum, yes, anyway now. And is it a standard of care if somebody can afford? Yes.
Okay. So we have discussed one more practice-changing paper where interviewee strongly believes that it's a practice-changing paper. Interviewer strongly believes it's a practice-changing paper. Now it is up to Senthil and finally Sudeep to change our mind if required. Over to Parikh sir. Thank you so much, Amit.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amit Agarwal and Dr. Amish Vora. That was absolutely fantastic. And now let us see how the discussion can be dissected further so that we can have a very good idea of how we treat our patients who are in front of us. Uh, our moderator is none other than Dr. Senthil Rajappa, who is the senior most medical oncologist at Indo-American Cancer Hospital in Hyderabad. And his panelists, besides Dr. Amit Agarwal, who was just interviewed, are Dr. Chetan Deshmukh, senior medical oncologist from Pune, Dr. Seema Gulia, senior medical oncologist from Tata Hospital, Mumbai, Dr. Mansi Shah, senior medical oncologist from SCG Ahmedabad, Dr. Vedant Kabra, surgical oncologist from New Delhi, Dr. Krupa Shankar, senior medical oncologist from Coimbatore, Dr. Venkata Pratip Babu, who is a medical oncologist at Tezpur in the TMH Tata Outreach Program, and Dr. Sushant Mittal, senior medical oncologist from Delhi. So, with this brief introduction, over to you, Senthil.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, Amish, for asking me to do this panel discussion. So we have a very erudite panel today. There's one, should I say, an odd man out in the panel who is a surgeon, who is Dr. Vedant Kabra. We will certainly take his inputs on the many things that we want to discuss as part of this panel discussion. So let me do that. Great. So I think the theme of today's panel is Keynote 522, to do or not to do. So that's what we will discuss in the next, I think we'll stop at 8:15. Okay, sir? Amish, 8:15 is fine?
It's fine.
Earlier. That's fine?
If Dr. Senthil Rajappa takes 5 more minutes, nobody's going to object. Don't worry.
Great. So 8:10 then. So okay. So just as much as Amish and Amit did a great job in dissecting out, we will stop at every point that Amish actually stopped Amit, and then ask our panelists as to what they feel about the many things that were enumerated as part of this study itself. So as Amish rightly started with, this is the slide that's showing you the randomization. Patients with triple negative breast cancer randomized to platinum-containing standard chemotherapy backbone of anthracycline taxane with Pembro for about 6 months, compared to the same chemotherapy backbone and placebo. And then you have an adjuvant pembrolizumab post-surgery, while the other arm does not get any drug at all. So that's the placebo arm. And the primary endpoint, as was mentioned, is a co-primary endpoint, which was discussed earlier. So let's start with asking the surgeon. Dr. Vedant is the trial population representative of the kind of patients that you see. There were 25% of patients who had T3, T4. Half of all patients who went into the study had node positivity. Is that what you would see in practice?
Yeah, we would see a similar pattern and probably higher rate of more advanced disease in our country.
So you would say T3, T4 is a little higher than the 25% that was,
yes.
As part of this study itself. Okay. So the second thing which I feel is very, very relevant, you could call that as the elephant in the room. Do all patients really who deserve neoadjuvant chemotherapy get neoadjuvant chemotherapy? Now, I'm not only referring to the tier 2 cities or places like that where practice might be a little different. I'm also talking about places where you would expect things to happen as per recommendation. Do you think that all patients or the majority who deserve neoadjuvant chemotherapy actually get it? What is your feeling, Dr. Vedant?
So in most of the institutions where there is MDT practice, I think most such patients would go for neoadjuvant chemotherapy. I can definitely talk about my institution. We send all patients who are T2 and above and node positive, if they are triple negative or if they are HER2 positive, for neoadjuvant therapy. Great,
very good. That's standard. Let me ask Chetan. Chetan, what percentage of patients who actually deserve neoadjuvant triple negative get the neoadjuvant therapy?
I have two answers for it.
Yes.
Parts. First part is about 80% of the population who deserves neoadjuvant chemotherapy, namely T3, T4 tumors or node positive disease in triple negative, do get neoadjuvant chemotherapy in my practice. But the problem is the way this thing has been given, total neoadjuvant chemotherapy, that is a problem.
Okay.
That is not given very often, and that is what we would like to do, because without that total neoadjuvant chemotherapy, create all other things don't even come into picture. So we prefer to do total neoadjuvant chemotherapy, but most of our surgeons want to operate as soon as the tumor has become operable.
Right. So, so majority who deserve get it, but
Yes.
they don't get it the ideal way, which is giving all the neoadjuvant therapy upfront. Dr. Mansi, is that the number in your city, would I say, not necessarily in your institute?
So I think I agree. I think almost 75 to 80% of patients do get neoadjuvant. And in our city, I think we are pretty much in tune with giving all the neoadjuvant therapy upfront. So we don't do the sandwich approach. That is kind of rarely done. The other thing is to get neoadjuvant chemotherapy first, especially elder patients who have TNBC. So there might be a patient factor which is contributing to people who are not receiving neoadjuvant.
Okay, very good. So I'm glad that 80% plus getting neoadjuvant chemotherapy when they deserve it is really a good number. I'm quite happy to hear that, and I hope that's what is a reflection of the practices everywhere in the country. Dr. Seema, the question is, would you have liked to see T1C? Now, there was a discussion between Amit and Amish as to whether T1C, not necessarily exactly the question that I'm asking, but something to do with T1C plus minus nodes that were positive. But do you think that T1C by itself would have merited neoadjuvant chemotherapy with a platinum-containing backbone and Pembro? Because if you look at retrospective analysis of patients with T1C who actually didn't get any adjuvant chemotherapy at all, this is after upfront surgery, there are series which show nearly a 25% relapse rate in those patients. Now, this is retrospective analysis with its own problems. So do you think there is some merit in saying that even if you have a T1C N0, you deserve to get whatever this trial has used as part of its experiment? Would you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that, because we hardly see T1C.
No, and let's say you see a T1C. That's a different question, whether we see it or not. Let's say you see a T1C. Would you be tempted to do this chemo plus Pembro?
No, not really. I won't be tempted to give full neoadjuvant chemotherapy along with Pembro and T1C tumor.
Excellent. So, Venkat?
Sir, T1C N0, no, sir.
Because the reason why I'm asking is in most of the guidelines that you see today, T1C has been added, not necessarily with Pembro, because this trial didn't have patients with T1C. But otherwise, if you see a recommendation for patients with T1C, it says that if you've got HER2 positive, or if you've got a triple negative tumor, those are also patients who deserve neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So I'm asking, because these patients also deserve, would you be willing to use a strategy like this for those patients? You would not.
Yes, it is very difficult to convince surgeons that to take up such.
We'll convince Vedant. That's not a problem. Vedant is he is a surgeon who understands biology, not only anatomy.
Not yet.
Correct. So he is somebody who understands biology.
Not yet for N0.
Not yet for N0. So even though you understand biology. Dr. Sushant, you also agree that T1C should not be part of this?
Also, Senthil, we must realize T1C and T2 is a difference of 5 mm. And it's very difficult to categorize.
Unfortunately, that's what TNM does. So that's the reason why I was asking, because most guidelines have added T1C as part of. Amit, what do you think of it? T1C? Amit Agarwal?
So you see the concept of neoadjuvant. Okay, you were very clear that these patients were not part of the trial. But I think the concept of neoadjuvant chemotherapy really started with CreateX. Now let's say you have a T1C N0 patient, and you're yourself saying that T1C N0 patient would have a 25% chance of a relapse, certain death, correct?
Yes.
So if you were to offer him, forget about the pembrolizumab. I'm not talking about pembrolizumab. I'm talking about simple plain ACT. Platinum has just come in, isn't it? So if you were to not achieve a PAT-CR, then which is a substantial number of patients, then on a non-PAT CR, you can salvage with a hazard ratio of 0.5. In a very rough calculation, if this of this 25% of patients, you can identify these 25% of patients and you can save this 12.5% of patient by giving adjuvant capecitabine. Does it make sense? Saving 12.5%. I mean, it's not a right maths. It's not a right maths.
Correct.
But I'm just giving the number that saving half of this 25%, does it matter? By identifying who requires it?
Difficult to say. I think the problem is that you will not be able to identify these patients upfront. So that's I think the greatest problem that we face, and that's the reason why you have to throw Pembro at everybody whom you think is eligible as per the keynote 522. So this is just a discussion. It's not a compulsion that everybody with T1C should go in, but with the response with the relapse rates that we are discussing about, it merits a thought. We come to ER and PR. Let's say somebody has got a T2N1 and the ER is 4% and the PR is 3%. How would you treat this patient, Dr. Seema? Okay, let's not talk about keynote 522 for a moment. Let's say this patient walks into your clinic, it's triple negative, but then based on the guideline, you're kind of tempted to treat it like an ER positive. So where does your management guideline fall there? How do you treat it, Seema?
So we all know that patient, but these are basically low ER/PR positive. They will behave like triple negative. So if there's you said node positive, correct?
Yeah, let's say T2N1 with ER 4%, PR 3%.
Yeah. So if it is clinically node positive, I would start them on neoadjuvant chemotherapy.
So you would treat it like a triple negative tumor?
Yeah.
What would you do in the adjuvant phase now if this patient does not get a PAT-CR, Seema?
That's a difficult question, because if they did not achieve PAT-CR and because she's ER 4%, in adjuvant setting, depending upon the menopausal status, I would advise her the hormonal therapy.
Would you be tempted to use capecitabine? Because I do capecitabine, I admit it here. So because of the reason that you exactly pointed out, saying that these are patients who behave like triple negative, and would you also be tempted to use capecitabine plus tamoxifen or plus letrozole, whatever it is, because we also know that this ER/PR poor patient is unlikely to be a hormone responsive patient also. What would you do? I mean, I don't think anybody knows the answer. I'm just asking you as to how you handle this in practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, in adjuvant setting, usually capecitabine is not combined with any hormone therapy.
Okay.
Though in metastatic setting, we have done in few patients, but not in the adjuvant setting.
All right. So far, as of now, you don't combine the two, you just use hormonal therapy. That's perfectly all right. Dr. Sushant, how would you handle a situation like this, Sushant?
Sir, I would be tempted to use hormonal plus capecitabine. I would like to give the benefit of both.
Okay. Dr. Kripa Shankar?
Yeah, so hi, sir. So I think by definition, I would definitely take this as hormone receptor positive, because anything more than 1%, you would take it as hormone receptor positive.
Correct.
But endocrine responsiveness is a different subset, because 1 to 10%, we know they're not going to respond well to endocrine therapy. I mean, meaning the Aldrich score might be low as well. But yeah, so I would definitely be tempted to do capecitabine if they have residual disease along with hormones.
So that's would you be tempted to do Pembro also then if you're treating this like a triple negative?
No.
Okay. So I think that's a difficult point. Amit, what would your thought be, Amit?
So for pembrolizumab, there was a long discussion during these plenary presentations and other. And everybody wanted to use pembrolizumab for these low ER/PR positive or low ER positive and PR negative population. But they were categorical about the fact that they will not have the drug supplied because they are ER positive. So that is what their problem was. But everybody said that if the insurance or the sectors were not an issue, they would offer pembrolizumab to this patient. That is what their
absolutely. I think so. So it's a difficult. Yeah, great. I think that's a very important point. So these are two gray areas where we are very tempted because one is the biology is different, because even though the ER and PR are qualitatively positive, quantitatively, you know that 3%, 4% is as good as negative. T1C is another area where the outcome still continues to be poor, but since it's not part of the inclusion criteria of the study, and some of us feel that we may be able to salvage them with just capecitabine, but there's always the patient who may not. Then we go into the basal versus the non-basal and all that story. So it becomes difficult, but it's a question of our opinion and what our patients sitting across the table will feel in case we propose a strategy like this. So these are gray areas that I wanted to point out as far as the study is concerned. Okay, so we come to another controversial area. Pradeep, happy with the chemotherapy backbone? So Amit spoke many times during his interview about the brightness study. So do you think based on the brightness study, Amit also said that was not the primary endpoint, it was a post hoc analysis comparing Pacli versus Pacli Carbo, showing that the event-free survival hazard ratio is exactly what you get with the addition of Pembro in this, somewhere around 0.62, 0.63. So for most people in the breast cancer world, that seems to be adequate evidence that platinum is now part of the chemotherapy, neoadjuvant chemotherapy backbone for triple negative cancer. So Pradeep, would you, as Amit said, incorporate platinum for all your patients, or you think the jury is still not out?
So I am really convinced by Dr. Amit Agarwal's way of discussion of adding platinum. So from now onwards, I am convinced to use platinum.
So you will be happy to use platinum. Great, Chetan, platinum for everybody?
No, not for everybody.
Okay.
There will be some patients who will be diabetics, elderly ladies, where giving 2 neurotoxic drugs is going to be a problem. Giving steroids, dextrose solutions every week is going to be a problem.
Okay.
Ladies who are above 70 years or so, giving them a doublet chemotherapy as it is going to be a problem. They may or may not tolerate it. So not for everybody, but yes, for a fit patient who doesn't have any poorly controlled diabetes or any underlying neuropathy, definitely platinum addition would be a great value addition.
Okay, great. So platinum in selective patients. Dr. Mansi, so if you're going to use Keynote 522, would you also want to use the platinum? Because there is some data that platinum is immunogenic and it may actually improve the responses that you get with pembrolizumab. Is that a reason based on which you would certainly want to use the platinum if you're using pembrolizumab?
So, Dr. Sandil, if I can actually just take a step back.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the debate for using platinum for all TNBC is still come to a consensus. I think there's still a controversy. We're not able to identify the subset of population which actually benefit from platinum. And in my clinical experience, I feel I'm not sure. I really am not convinced that platinum actually adds a whole lot to the PCR.
Okay.
So that is my take on platinums for everyone. I don't use it for everyone. In terms of using platinum, the chemotherapy backbone along with immunotherapy agents, I think pretty much all of the neoadjuvant trials which have used immunotherapy have used platinums. And so if I am truly evidence-based, then I would use a lot of immunotherapy. One of the reasons is the one that you mentioned. And the other reason I think is just based on evidence, what regimen I use.
So that's a good point that you're not convinced and you think the jury is still not convinced that platinum is part of treatment for everybody. But let me go back to Seema. Seema Mansi made a very important point. She said that based all trials using immunotherapy have used platinum, but I want to draw your attention to the Jepar-Nuo. Again, Amit pointed out, though he didn't use the name Jepar-Nuo, and the IM Power or IM Passion, which is breast cancer 031, both of which produce the same delta in PATH-CRs, same delta, not in terms of the absolute value, but did not use platinum. And the Jepar-Nuo, again, Amit pointed this out, had the same hazard ratio in a smaller set of patients, 174 patients versus just over 1,000 patients. You really can't compare the numbers. But just with the neoadjuvant backbone of ACT and in their trial durvalumab, they ended up with a hazard ratio of 0.63, which is bang on the same as what you get with the use of pembrolizumab, platinum, anthracycline, and taxane. So again, just a thought, do you think that you would use the platinum because it's immunogenic and it increases the PATH-CRs, or would you say the event-free survival has been achieved in a smaller trial with same, with a less intensive backbone? So I would be happy to give up the platinum. What would be your thoughts, Seema?
Yeah, if we look at the data from these 3 trials, Keynote 522, Jepar-Nuo, as well as Impassion 031, as you have rightly mentioned, the improvement in PAT-CR is anywhere between 13 to 14%.
Correct.
Though Japan Neo is a phase 2 trial with a smaller number, it has also shown that even with only neoadjuvant immunotherapy, the improvement in invasive disease-free survival is also close to the same magnitude as with Keynote 522 without platinum. So I would be tempted to not use platinum if I am adding immunotherapy.
Okay, great. So I think our panelists are also divided with respect to the use of platinum. Some of us think that since it increases the PAT-CR, we should use it routinely for all our patients with TNBC. Some of us think that it should be very selectively used. The criteria might differ depending upon whom you ask. And again, there is a place to use it as a drug which increases immunogenicity when you use it with an immune checkpoint inhibitor. Similarly, there is also data to say that you can do away with the platinum because you can get the same results without that drug if you add an immune checkpoint inhibitor. Again, the data is all over the place, but if you're following Keynote 522, platinum is the way to go because you want to do some kind of a copybook treatment rather than change it if you're using the Keynote 522 itself. Amish, I think that's the question. If we use Pembro in NACT, do we have Seema thinks that she may do away with the platinum, but Mansi thinks that she will want to keep the platinum because it is immunogenic. So I think we don't have a categorical right answer. So it depends upon. So I think we would follow the same rule. Use the platinum if you're getting toxicity because of platinum. You're happy to drop it. You're not very worried that you're making a big compromise. If you're able to carry it on, you carry it on. Sometimes I think I would want to use the anthracycline first and then see if your patient is not responding well to that anthracycline, use the platinum next, which is what I do in clinical practice today because we have not adopted platinum as the standard of care. So I do it in patients who don't have a good response to the anthracycline. So I think each one of us will have our way of wriggling out from this difficult situation. But the jury is not yet out as far as routine incorporation of platinum in the neoadjuvant setting is concerned. Great. We have had 20 minutes already gone. So we will quickly look at the results in a glance. PAT-CR and event-free survival, these were the co-primary endpoints, both positive, consistent benefit, consistent. Now this consistent is with one interim analysis after the other. That's what it is. The overall survival is trending towards a positivity. We'll have to wait for that. Great. So let's come to these very important curves. This is the event-free survival at the interim analysis number 4. 0.63, 7.7% is the delta. Chetan, clinically significant?
Yes.
Okay, so you would adopt it. Kripashankar, clinically significant?
Yeah, definitely yes, sir. But just to play the devil's advocate here, I think probably was the standard arm actually weakened because they did not do response adapted therapy there. I mean, like there was no capecitabine or there was no Olympia back then. So probably was the standard arm or was the control arm weakened? So I think that's my only probably point to debate here. But as of such, it's definitely clinically significant.
Very good. We'll come to that discussion a little later, Kripashankar. But your point is well taken that the control arm was placebo, and today looking back, you would have wanted to do many things as part of the control arm. Pradeep, clinically significant, ready to adopt in practice, like Amit said, if you have a patient with a deep pocket.
So that's very rare in my scenario, sir. It's like
if you have a patient.
Yes, sir, definitely, sir.
Sushant, all convinced that if you have the right patient, then you're happy to adopt this in practice, Sushant?
I would adopt it, sir, but I have just one thing which keeps happening in my mind.
Okay.
Is that rest of the immunotherapeutic agents, why didn't they show this benefit? What was so different or what is so special about Pembro that the other immunotherapeutic
So I think as we pointed out, Sushant, Japan Neo has already shown an EFS benefit, though the delta as far as PCR was much lesser than what you saw in this study. The other two studies have not shown. In fact, the NeoTrip, which is the Atizor study, Atizor seems to be failing everywhere as far as breast cancer is concerned. Poor drug, poor company. The delta in PCR was only 2.2%. Again, we will always come up with some reason to explain our failures. But, 2 out of 4 trials showing EFS, it's not bad at all. So I wouldn't agree with your point that the other studies are not showing at all. So it is showing. So with what you're seeing on the screen here, are you happy to adopt it?
Yes, I'm happy to adopt it. I'm happy.
Great, very good. Is there anybody who wants to say that this is not showing an overall survival benefit and hence I don't want to adopt it? Okay, looks like nobody wants to say that. This is the overall survival curve, again starting to separate. But this is immature, early days, so we will have to wait and see if this will pan into an overall survival benefit. Looks like it will, with overall, longer duration of follow-up that we will get. Great. So, Pradeep, let me start with you. You're the one who raised the issue of I won't see a patient at all. Amit said that he would want to do, though he clearly said that patients would benefit irrespective of their PDL1. But if you want to choose somebody with a shoestring budget, most of our patients are, would you be tempted to toe Amit's line and say, I will want to do the, CPS 22C3 and then decide whether I want to do this drug on my patient or not? Would you do that, Pradeep?
So in the trial, they have not selected the patients based upon the PDL1 status. So if I have to choose the patient, I will choose based upon the stage and the fitness of the patient and nodal positivity rather than PDL1s.
Very good. Dr. Mansi, CPS of greater than 20, as Amit rightly said, 81% versus 62%, 20% jump in the PCR. Would that tempt you to use this? I've also highlighted the event-free survival based on positive versus negative, though not the best way to interpret, if at all. The AFS hazard ratio for the negative seems to be better than the positives, though the numbers are very, very small, just to show you that number as such. Dr. Mansi, PDL1, no PDL1.
I use the perspective of the PDL1 status Dr. Sankar, because if you look at the difference between the PAT CRs, PDL1, there is an increase in the PAT CR by using Pembro, if you're just looking at PAT CRs.
Okay, if you're just looking at PAT CRs, it's increasing. So you may want to do the PDL1 and then make a decision. Is that what you're saying?
So I would do Pembro irrespective of because I feel it gives a benefit and all.
Okay, so you're saying you would want to do it. Amit, I wanted to ask you a question. Amit, suppose there comes a data after some analysis that the EFS hazard ratio or the difference would vary vastly based on the PDL1 scoring. Would that tempt you and all of us to do the PDL1 rather than doing it just because it improves the PCR? Amit?
If there is a data like that, then in a country like ours, possibly yes.
Okay. Krupashankar, would that also tempt you if the EFS comes? We don't have the EFS data based on the PDL1 brackets or ranges, as we say. But if, let's say, a year from now, they do that analysis and come out with those numbers, would you say that this is unplanned subset analysis, so I don't want to give credence to this? Or would you say, I am tempted in a country like ours, as Amit is saying, that if the EFS benefit is huge in a group and it's not that much in another group, I would decide to use this based on the PDL1 positivity?
So, yeah, definitely, sir. I would definitely look at using it in patients with PDL1 positive, simply because this trial also, the majority of patients, around 83% were PDL1 positive. So we're only looking at probably a small proportion, 17% who are actually PDL1 negative. Correct. So I think, so I would definitely look at giving a lot of importance to the PDL1 as a biomarker, and also look at, using it only in those patients, given that we come from a resource constrained setting. Yeah, so I would definitely do that.
Okay. Seema,
so
I want
can I, sorry.
Yeah, Amit, go ahead, Amit. Yeah.
So, if the data for a differential response as an EFS comes into picture, then I think that will be very tempting.
Okay.
Because it is not that we want to look at the trial endpoint from a PAT-CR capability. We are looking at the trial endpoint from a PCR lens because we don't have any EFS data. We don't strongly believe that PCR is completely proportional to EFS. Isn't it what we were discussing? Okay. But the point is, in absence of EFS data so far, we're using an indirect evidence, hopefully, to do that. But if the EFS data comes through, let's say that 80% PD1 positive has an EFS of 100%. Let's say, I'm just guessing so. It would definitely change our thought process. EFS is what we are looking at, which we don't have at this point.
Dr. Seema, a question on the chat box. I just want you to take this quickly. Does the sequence of chemotherapy matter when you're using Keynote 522? AC first versus, Taxol and carboplatin later, would it matter?
No, I don't think that the sequence of chemotherapy will matter if we are combining pembrolizumab. I would like to add on the PD-L1 discussion.
Seema. Yes.
So in early stage breast cancer, the PD-L1 is basically a dynamic marker where, I mean, you have shown this, which I am about to talk about, this NeoTrip data.
Go ahead.
If we look at this data, there is a change in PD-L1 status even within 2 to 3 weeks of therapy after chemotherapy. So patients who were PD-L1 negative, they became PD-L1 positive later on. So if I decide to give a patient treatment based on Keynote 522, I would not prefer to do a PD-L1. But if I have a metastatic patient where PD-L1 positivity is predictive for response to immunotherapy, there I would do, but not in the early stage.
Very nice, Seema. I think these two are very, very relevant points. In the metastatic setting, it is important to do. You need to have a CPS of more than or equal to 10, because that's the group in which immune checkpoint inhibitors have shown an overall survival benefit. In the early setting, the outcome in terms of PAT-CR seems to be dependent on the PD-L1 positivity, but we don't have the EFS data. But if you look at the forest plot, there's no difference whether you have a positivity or a negativity. All these patients tend to benefit from the addition of pembrolizumab, and we shouldn't be dissecting the PD-L1 data as much as we tend to do because of what you exactly said. Look at, there is nearly a 70% change in the PD-L1 the moment you start on these drug combinations, and we shouldn't be thinking about the fact that we did it earlier and then it's going to remain the same, and that's what is going to decide upon what the outcome is likely to be. So a general, advisory, if you want to say, would be that you don't need to do a PD-L1, but if you want to look at the PAT-CRs in higher PD-L1s and you want to do it, you're not totally wrong in doing that. But benefit is not definitely dependent upon the PD-L1 only. So there's a lot of...
Senthil, I have a point.
Yeah, Amit. And then you can take this question also, Amit. Would you do adjuvant pembro only?
Okay. So, the point is very valid. What Seema is talking is what is now being termed as plasticity of PD-L1. Correct? That's what she's talking about. Very well said that these numbers vary. But that's okay. But we only have a static PD-L1 in this trial. We don't have a dynamic PD-L1.
Correct.
Even if they had a serial biopsy, they'll come to later. We know that this static single PD-L1 is able to influence the PCR rates. Despite the plasticity of PD-L1, it is able to influence the ability to achieve a PAT-CR. Correct? Whether it is able to affect EFS or not is anybody's guess at this point of time. Therefore, I said, if you prove in future that this static PD-L1, not the dynamic PD-L1, is able to influence EFS, then I think that's a point which has to be accepted. Correct? But in the absence of that data, the only data that we have is ability to achieve PAT-CR. If you value PAT-CR, which I'm not myself very sure, then if you value PAT-CR, then this static PD-L1 matters. If you don't value, then anybody's guess.
Absolutely. Based on the available data, you're just going based on only one value. And that's what I think that's what we're doing in every malignancy. I don't know whether we have data in lung cancer to say that just because the PD-L1 changes later, you should not be using it at the time of diagnosis. At least I'm not aware of any data like that. So all the PD-L1s that we have been doing in order to choose patients for our therapy, same metastatic disease. Again, we are basing it on what happens on day one when we see our patient. We're basing it on one area that we biopsy. There's data that if you biopsy the lymph node, you're likely to have more. If you biopsy the liver, you're likely to be less. So I think it's too dynamic. But fortunately or unfortunately, that's the best marker that we have as of today. And the discussion that we had a couple of days ago, Amit, that even if you get a big biomarker, I don't know whether you will be able to validate it and use it in day-to-day practice. So for some time to come, I think you won't get beyond the PD-L1 story as far as immune checkpoint inhibitors is concerned. Amit, another question, if you don't do neoadjuvant, would you be willing to offer these patients with high risk triple negative just adjuvant PD-L1?
Not at this point.
Not at this point in time. Great. So we come to this very interesting, bar chart that I'm showing you here, that when you look at the Keynote 522 and Compassion 031, let's leave that for the moment. Patients with node negative and node positivity, when you use the same chemotherapy backbone, look at what Pembro does negative or positive lymph nodes, your PCR jumps to the same number, which is 64.9, 64.8, magically similar. But the chemotherapy doesn't seem to be able to push that PCR equally in patients with node positivity and negativity. So I was just thinking to throw this question, Chetan, does immune checkpoint inhibitor help overcome the negative prognostic impact of a nodal positivity? What would your thought be?
Yeah, based on this study, yes, I think it would.
So you're saying based on the PAT CRs that get better, it seems to be at least in part helping to overcome
helping, yes.
In part at least. Kripashankar, would that also be your interpretation? Kripashankar, are you around?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me, sir? Yeah. So I think probably here the numbers are probably much better because you have an equal proportion of more than patients who had node positive disease as well as negative. So I think probably yes, it's fair to sort of draw that inference.
Okay, it's fair to draw that inference. Dr. Mansi, you would also agree with that? Dr. Mansi? Seema, would you also? Seema, go ahead. I think Mansi is having some problem with the connection. Seema?
Yeah, maybe node positivity improves responses to immunotherapy.
Okay. So there seems to be some tendency to think that you may be able to overcome some of that negative impact of nodal positivity in patients with these high risk, problems. Okay. So Sushant, let me ask you this question. This is, the projection based on the response achieved to neoadjuvant therapy. At the top, you see patients with a pathological complete response. Amit pointed this out. Do you think there is merit in continuing the immune checkpoint inhibitor if a patient achieves a pathological complete response? That's the hazard ratio for that projection that you're seeing. 0.73, 1.36 is the upper limit of confidence interval. These are not, these are post hoc analysis. 2% difference in terms of the EFS. Do you think you would want to use Pembro in the adjuvant if a patient achieves PAT-CR?
I don't think I'll be using that.
You don't think you will be using that? Seema, would you be using? And then Dr. Mansi, would you be using?
No, in patient who has achieved pathological CR, I would not like to continue pembrolizumab.
Okay. Dr. Mansi,
I agree. I think although the authors have said that because the hazard ratio between these two arms is the same, they would use it, but I'm not sure if I agree with that.
Okay, so you are saying that you wouldn't want to use it. Kripashankar, want to use it, don't want to use it?
So probably, I would probably look at continuing itself because let's not forget that it's probably with the addition of Pembro that I've got the PAT-CR. So probably I'm prone to continuing that and going with the trial as well here.
Okay, excellent. So that brings us to a very important point, Kripashankar. I'm glad you made that. You said patients are responding, so I would like to continue it. True. So let's ask this question. Patients didn't respond well, but they still had an improvement if they didn't achieve a pathological complete response, because the standard approach and the standard way we would look at this, this situation is that something didn't work well in the neoadjuvant setting. And so I am tempted not to use that in the adjuvant setting. And as you rightly said, something worked well in the neoadjuvant setting, so I want to continue. But the paradox is here, it's just the opposite. You see that for patients who responded well, they're great. For patients who didn't respond well, continuing the pembrolizumab in the adjuvant setting gave you significant improvement, and that is clinically important, 56 to 67%. So that's 11% improvement, absolute improvement in the EFS. How do we really, agree with that? Or, is it not counterintuitive to the way we actually practice medicine itself, cancer medicine itself? Anybody who wants to take that? Seema, would you want to take that?
So probably the patient who had residual disease after neoadjuvant therapy, their continuing immunotherapy have improved the outcome.
Correct.
Right? And this is known with immunotherapies that even though they may not have a pathological CR, but continuing them in adjuvant setting may continue to show the response, and this trial has proven that. But a patient who has already achieved a pathological CR and it is known that patient who have pathological CR, achievement of pathological CR is prognostic.
Okay, so you're saying that this is not contrary to the way we think. Amit Agarwal, would you, what is your thought on, continuing the Pembro? Of course, it's showing a benefit, so we will continue. But isn't it not counterintuitive to the way we are used to thinking?
My take on this question, I mean, it's a very complex question. Obviously, nobody knows the answer. Honestly speaking, nobody knows the answer. So let me assume that this drug is effective. This drug is effective. We are unfortunately looking at this drug from the perspective of PATH-CR.
Correct.
So if I would analyze this trial in different way, this drug is effective and it has a hazard ratio of 0.73, irrespective of ability to achieve a PATH-CR or inability to achieve a PATH-CR. Correct? This is another.
Correct, absolutely. So it is benefiting. There's no doubt.
Please don't look, if I was to say, please don't look at PATH-CR. Please look at the fact that this drug has 27% capability of reducing the event-free survival, irrespective of ability to achieve PATH-CR. Correct? It's a right statement.
Absolutely, we will use it. There's no
now
doubt
ask the question again. Now ask the question again. This drug reduces event-free survival event by 27%. It independent of ability to achieve PATH-CR. The problem is we're looking at the data set through PATH-CR.
Okay, that's a good point.
So let's put the question again, or to all the panelists, please forget PATH-CR. The drug has a capability of achieving 27% event-free survival advantage, irrespective of PATH-CR. Are you going to look through the PATH-CR now?
Okay, let's ask our panelist, Kripa Shankar. How would you answer Amit's question? So forget about the PCR for a moment. Here is a drug that's giving you 27% improvement in the EFS. Would you just close your eyes and say, I will use it because that's clinically significant? Or would you say, I will want to base my decision on the PATH-CR? Is that correct, Amit?
So yeah, I think, sir, response adapted therapy in breast cancer, especially in triple negative breast cancer and in HER2 breast cancer, is here to stay. I think that's, we've had enough and more discussed about that. So if somebody has not had a PATH-CR despite giving immune checkpoint inhibitors along with platinum in the neoadjuvant setting, I would probably look at adding something along with the IO.
Okay.
in the adjuvant.
So
I
think there are so many.
Or olaparib, depending on the patient's BRCA mutation analysis, I would definitely look at adding that along with the pembro.
So it's just another example of logic need not necessarily be oncologic, as they say. So where you would not expect it to turn it around, it seems to be turning it around. Where it's doing well, you probably don't need anything more. So I think these are unanswered questions. But the data is here. It improves the outcome for patients who don't achieve a PATH-CR. So we will certainly continue it based on the Keynote 522. The question is whether you would want to add anything on top of that, whether it is olaparib for patients with BRCA mutant or just switch to olaparib, stop the pembro or add capecitabine. So is there a set of patients whom you want to add something on top of pembro? Because if you look at this curve, these patients are not doing that very well. It's still 67.4% EFS, right? So a significant proportion still continue to get their disease back. So if at this point, so there is safety data for capecitabine plus immune checkpoint inhibitor, olaparib plus immune checkpoint inhibitor. So that's not a concern. We don't have efficacy data. There is safety data. So Dr. Mansi, if I ask you a patient where you might want to add one of these drugs on top of the pembro, what would you do? Let's say if somebody has a YPT4 or YPN2, would you be tempted to add capecitabine on top of pembro if you had a patient like that?
So I think I would be tempted to add, but I think we are kind of like pushed towards it, giving more and more. I'm not sure how much benefit we would be giving our patients. In the absence of any standard clinical data, I would not. I would be tempted to, but I don't think I would translate that into clinical practice.
Excellent. So you'd be tempted to, but you wouldn't want to do Seema. Would you be tempted?
Yeah, for BRCA non-mutant, I would be tempted to use capecitabine with pembrolizumab, though there is no data. And for BRCA germline mutant, I would tempt to use olaparib with pembrolizumab based on the efficacy data, but obviously there is no clinical data. And I'm sure there are trial ongoing, though in future we will have those efficacy data as well.
Very good. So all of us are tempted to use it in a patient who's got plenty of residual disease. Pradeep, would you also agree with that?
No, sir. So anything that is not documented, not in the clinical trial, I would not use. So I would follow the clinical trial and I would continue.
Very good. So you're like Sunil Gavaskar. It looks like you will do only copybook drives. You won't do a helicopter, one like Dhoni or anybody like that.
Because before starting anything that is not, I remember Purvisha talks about medical legal issues. So something happens in the adjuvant setting. Had it been metastatic setting, definitely I would try combination. So in adjuvant setting, I would think twice to start anything.
Okay, so you're worried about legal issues. All right, that's fine. So it's 8:15, so I'm not going to push this beyond. I'm just going to quickly conclude. So these are the unanswered questions. I think we discussed a lot of it. The intention was not meant to confuse people. The intention was to bring out the areas that are gray as far as 522 is concerned, though all of us clearly agreed that it is practice changing and we will use it in the appropriate patient. So these are the unanswered questions for me. Do we need platinum in the neoadjuvant setting? Can we predict who will achieve a PCR with chemo? You know, if we were able to find that out, all this mess will not really arise. We can choose on day one whom you want to do pembro, whom you can just be happy with chemotherapy. We don't have that. Should we use the strategy in T1C and low ER tumors? Again, we are divided. Some thinking that, you know, you will have to use a hybrid approach in patients who are low ER and so on. I don't think we have a good answer. Who does not need an IO? Certainly, most of us felt that people with PAT-CR don't need it, but as far as the trial is concerned, you need to continue. Can we do with a shorter course of IO? We didn't have time to discuss this, but that's, I think, a very relevant question in our setting. Just the neoadjuvant part, forget about the adjuvant part. You can use capecitabine after that if your patient doesn't achieve. But we also discussed the fact that that's the area where pembro actually looks like adding a bigger number. How to incorporate capecitabine PARP inhibitors? All of us are tempted in a small group of patients who don't do well to add these drugs, but I don't think we have any clinical data. Better biomarkers, we keep on talking about this, but whether this will really happen or not, I don't know. We will wait and see at this point in time. And the reason why I put Amit's picture here is that that would be one other unanswered question. Do we all agree with Amit that we should be incorporating Keynote 522 in our practice? For me, yes. Let me quickly run through all of you. Kripa Shankar, yes, no.
Yes, sir.
Chetan, yes, no.
Sorry, I didn't get your question. Can you?
Would we incorporate Keynote 522 tomorrow morning in the appropriate patient?
Oh, yes.
Mansi?
Yes, sir.
Seema?
Yes, sir.
Pradeep?
Yes, sir, in eligible patients.
Sushant?
Yes, sir.
Great. So, Amish, that answers your question. Thank you so much. And I hand it over back to Amish and Purvisha. Thanks so much for that opportunity. Lovely having all you panelists, and the way you navigated through all these questions and gave us very appropriate, clinically relevant answers. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Senthil. As usual, you've done an awesome job of moderating after the fantastic interview with Dr. Amit Agarwal. And I think it's the real value of a moderator is when finer points and controversies are brought out and discussed as you have done. Now we have none other than Dr. Sudeep Gupta to give the expert conclusion and the way forward. As everybody knows, Dr. Gupta is director of ACTRAC at Tata Memorial Center, and he is a world-renowned expert on breast cancer. And we have a special, bond with him because this whole series of Oncology Beyond the Obvious started with Dr. Sudeep Gupta agreeing to be interviewed. So, sir, over to you for the expert conclusion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parekh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for your kind introduction, and also I thank both yourself and Dr. Amish Vora for inviting me to do the expert comments. I think Oncology Beyond the Obvious has really come of age and very fast, and that's the first conclusion. I think it's a very enjoyable series, and I hope that it continues and will scale greater heights in the time to come. So congratulations to you and to Amish for a fantastic format. I really enjoyed the deliberations today, and I think both the interviewer and the interviewee were absolutely spot on. They were sharp in their exchange and to the point, and I think most of the things were very nicely covered. So my congratulations to both of them for doing a fantastic interview. And of course, as always, Dr. Senthil Rajappa brought out most of the nuances that needed to be brought out in the panel discussion. I don't know how much time I have, but I just wanted to touch on 4 or 5 points. Do I have 5 minutes? Is that okay?
Yes, please go ahead, Sudeep.
Okay, so as I was listening to the discussions, I noted a few things on my pad. So the first thing was about the value and the utility of pathological complete response as or pathological response as an endpoint in and of itself. So I think Amit very nicely summed it up that pathological complete response is not an intrinsically useful endpoint. And I think he made the point repeatedly during today's interaction that event-free survival or eventually overall survival are the more useful endpoints. I just wanted to add something. With few exceptions, actually the delta in PathCR, let me again say the delta in PathCR with a new treatment, with few exceptions, has a high negative predictive value, which means if you do not achieve a better PathCR with addition of a new agent, then you are unlikely to achieve a benefit in overall survival. And I acknowledge that Amit did cite 1 or 2 exceptions. So it has a relatively high negative predictive value. The problem is that it has a very low positive predictive value for betterment in long-term survival. So if I was a drug company, I would screen a particular drug and I would take it very seriously. If I do not achieve an improvement in PathCR, I would think twice whether to take it forward or to really expect a long-term survival benefit. But if I do achieve an improvement in PathCR, I'm still not sure whether it will result in a survival benefit or not. The second thing is that there was a lot of discussion about the utility of PDL1 in the setting of Keynote 522. I must say that if the relative benefit, and by the relative benefit, I mean the hazard ratio, is the same in all prognostic subgroups, then simple mathematics tells us that the absolute benefit will be higher in individuals who have a worse prognosis. So the same 30% reduction in mortality or in disease-free survival events will result in a 3% benefit in a population that has a 90% survival versus it will have a 10% benefit in a population that has a 30%, that has a 70% survival. So PDL1 has been repeatedly shown is actually prognostic. So we saw here that the patients who are PDL1 negative are doing worse compared to those who are PDL1 positive. So I don't think that, we should really look at PDL1 while choosing patients for a Keynote 522 type of treatment. And I think that has also been brought out by many of the panelists. I do not think that if somebody had the money or did not have the money, we should use PDL1 to choose a patient for this treatment. Because if anything, going by the worst prognosis in the PDL1 negative group and there being no interaction with the treatment, the absolute benefit, if anything, might actually be higher, but not lower. The third thing was, I think a lot of discussion happened about T1C tumors and whether neoadjuvant, etc. or not. And of course, we can have 2 or 3 opinions about whether we should use neoadjuvant in those patients or not. But there was a estimate that was repeatedly discussed that 25% of such patients relapse. The data that was being actually communicated was without chemotherapy. Here, the comparison will never ever be without chemotherapy. Even if you use adjuvant chemotherapy in a T1C node negative tumor with a triple negative, the outcome will not be 75% disease-free survival. It will be closer to about 90% or at least 87 or 88%. So actually, I just want in perspective that are historical series or other series that show that, if you do not use chemotherapy in T1 tumors, then what happens? Then there was a lot of discussion about platinum. And let me say my opinion, the headline opinion, if one has to use if one chooses to use the Keynote 522 type of treatment, then I think one must use platinum. And we have repeatedly seen that there can be all kinds of logic and theory, but the proof of pudding is finally in the eating, and in terms of oncology, it is in terms of clinical trial results. And so therefore, if at all it is possible to use it, one must use platinum. But there was also a discussion about whether platinum should become a routine treatment outside of a immunotherapeutic approach. And I think Dr. Mansi said it, and I completely agree with her that there isn't enough evidence at the moment to say that addition of platinum either in neoadjuvant or adjuvant or both will actually improve the long-term outcomes. And we have had conflicting results from the German study, the North American study, and the Brightness trial actually does not answer that question because it did not have, it is only reported on the pathological complete response, but not on the long-term survivals, and the sample size was small. So we do have a study that has completed accrual in Tata Memorial with 730 patients with disease-free survival as the endpoint, and we will see whether platinum adds to the long-term survival or not. There was a lot of discussion about pembrolizumab beyond PAT-CR and pembrolizumab beyond no PAT-CR. So I think the first, I would agree with Amit when he said that if you do not insert PAT-CR into the equation at all and just look at this drug, which has improved event-free survival by close to 8%, I think everybody will say that we should use it. But when you do look at it beyond PAT-CR or beyond no PAT-CR, I think beyond PAT-CR, there can be two opinions, even though the hazard ratio is more or less the same, but the absolute benefit is less because patients who do achieve a PAT-CR only with chemotherapy also have a very good outcome, or at least a relatively good outcome. But I think it is very important to continue to use this drug beyond no PAT-CR, because even though no PAT-CR is prognostic, but the delta in outcome was actually quite large. And as Amit correctly pointed out, most of the absolute benefit in event-free survival in this study is being driven by the group of patients who did not achieve a PAT-CR. So I think it is important, and there may be actually biological reasons. It is likely and important that patients who have a higher disease burden post-neoadjuvant treatment continue to present antigens and continue to in them, the immunological reprogramming continues to be important beyond the 12-week time point. So, I think whether we should add olaparib or capecitabine, etc., are different questions, and there can be two opinions about it. But I do think that the results that were achieved in the no PAT-CR group with pembrolizumab were achieved with 1 year of this treatment. So I think it may be important, at least in that group, to continue beyond that time point. I don't think I have anything else to say except the final conclusion that I think this trial could potentially be practice changing if the cost was more within the range of most Indians who need this drug. Unfortunately, at least in my practice, at the actual implementation at the ground level, it is unlikely to be practiced. It is unlikely to be used in the large majority of patients. But if there was a patient who could afford it and in whom this was feasible and who fitted into the criteria of the study, I think one should offer this drug to such a patient. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sudeep. This was an excellent. And I'm happy this time that you are giving the expert conclusion because last time I remember after your comments and your conclusion, the panelists probably completely swayed on the other side. But Sudeep, honestly speaking, this adds on your conclusion, adds on to our understanding so well. I think where Amit started and Senthil corroborated and you finally sort of gave a tick mark on all the questions which are there. Sudeep, really, really thank you so much. And Dr. Parekh and I will continue to request you to be on this platform again and again, again and again, again and again. Only one last point, which we keep talking about finances. I remember imatinib when it was launched by Novartis in CML, it was 1,10,000 rupees per month of the treatment. And today it is not even 5,000 rupees per month. So I think finances like PDL1 keeps changing, generics keep adding, and we need to keep looking at the science and offer to our patients. It's their choice whether they can afford it or not. With that, Parekh sir and myself, we wanted to thank everyone. And Parekh sir, next month, second Tuesday, we will have our 5th chapter of OBTO with your permission. We can conclude this, sir.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And have a great evening. And we look forward to the next session exactly in 1 month's time. Good night and take care, everyone.